next part of our program is really about the roles for patients and advocates, and how training like Big Data for Patients can be, that they can use that to continue with their work and also help interest them in maybe new work. So we have a panel, and if they would like to make their way up here, we have Joel Beach, who's moderating for us, and we have Amy Abernathy from Flatiron. We've got Sally from PatientsLikeMe, Rachel Florence from Pecora, and then Jane Perlmutter, who is going to be our patient advocate. And so I think there are just a few slides with a couple of them, so I will hand off the device, but then go ahead and let Joel get started.
Great, thank you, Diana. Am I going here? So, thank you. My name is Joel Beach. I'm the co-chair of the steering committee for this project, and it's been a pleasure to work with everyone in the room and the steering committee members, and also the Reagan-Udall. I was selected for this panel discussion not only as the co-chair, but I also have 4 sisters that I can moderate table discussion quite well, and I have 3 wife and 2 young daughters at home, so I'm totally surrounded by very powerful women. So I'm pleased to do this today, but I'm also very pleased to have my colleagues with me. And I think what we'll do is have some general comments from each member of the panel about who they are and what they do and what their organization does. And then there's some questions that is part of your agenda that I'd like to ask, or they'll probably address some of it, and we'll dig a little bit deeper as we get into the dialogue, but also for you to ask questions of them, both from the audience and online, because the questions that we're hearing, both at our small table discussions as well as what you just gave back to Steve, were how can I apply this? I think the application word in both what Steve said and the comments that you had was critical. And I think the application piece is going to be a very big thing for us to think about, both here and as the steering committee and the curriculum development team and the full application team finishes out the work as we move to end of September. So Amy, why don't we start with you? Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Amy Abernathy, and I am the Chief Medical Officer and Chief Scientific Officer at Flatiron Health in New York City. Flatiron is a company really that focuses on how do we use data and technology to improve the lives of patients in the cancer space, and we're focused specifically in cancer, and also how do we do so through accelerating research. So fundamentally, research and discovery is in our mission and our byline, and really, if we kind of back up and when we think about the Flatiron story, there's a couple of core elements that are relevant to today's conversation. The first is, in order to do the work within Flatiron, what we're doing is building software and tools and technology that are used by cancer care providers, and then through that, a complete copy of the medical records being brought in, and we're processing those data and then using them for a series of secondary research purposes. The data are de-identified, but there's still a whole bunch of issues that go along with the use of data that are de-identified using current rules of de-identification, but the practical realities are that re-identification may be possible. There's also the need to prioritize which questions and which things we do are in most benefit of accelerating research in society, and lots of things going on. So there's questions around privacy, there's questions around priority, and there also were questions around how do we make sure that the patient voice is integrated into the data sets. I'm going to actually come to that last piece and sort of stop there for a second, because I think that's the thing I wanted to talk about specifically in the BD4P project that might otherwise not get addressed. We think often about making sure that patient advocates are skilled in the conversation of big data and the applications of big data. One of the other places that we're seeing in Flatiron is how do we make sure that patients are skilled in the how do we ensure our information is a part of big data. And practically speaking, one of the things that we've seen is the importance, for example, of reimbursement drivers in how that means data are not available as a part of routinely collected information. And just one little practical story from the cancer space. Prior to my time at Flatiron, many of you know I spent a lot of time in the patient-reported outcomes world, and sort of thinking about how do we collect patient-generated health data of all kinds to make sure that this was a deep part of our data sets. Then I got to Flatiron, and I was so excited we're going to have patient-reported outcomes, and we were constantly trying to figure out how we were going to bring patient-generated health data into the data sets, and got excited about the oncology care model as a new activity that would bring in patient-generated health data. What we saw all across the country as this CMS innovation project was going on was cancer clinics and technologists and healthcare providers of all types in the cancer space gearing up for technology and solutions to collect patient-reported outcomes as a routine part of care. Why? Because there were 3 required quality measures in this CMS innovation project that were going to require PROs. And because of those required quality measures and the reimbursement drivers that went along with them, what we were going to see was sort of technology and healthcare work practices move forward to patient-generated health data as a routine part of healthcare. What we saw was when those quality measures transitioned from PROs to actually things that clinicians could write down, all of that activity shut off in terms of the development of processes for patient-generated health data. So my real point here is that one of the goals within BD4P is making sure that patient advocates are equipped with the skills of big data, but also in the skills of advocating for patient-generated health data within what they do.
Great, thank you, Amy. And I'll save my questions till we get to the end here. There's a few critical factors. I'll take a few notes as you guys talk, and please, you guys in the audience as well, but I'll pass it to Sally.
Okay, great. So I'm Sally Oken from Patients Like Me, and one of the things I like to start with sometimes is just sort of leveling the room about who we are, but also leveling the room about who patients are. So this cartoon is just a wonderful illustration of who the expert is in the room and why something like big data for patients is such an incredibly important contribution to our understanding of that. So I'll leave you with that moment there. Just again, to level the room about Patients Like Me, we are a research-based social network. We've been around for over 11 years now. We were started by virtue of the one family's experience of living with a chronic fatal illness, Stephen Haywood's diagnosis with ALS. And it actually emerged from there to being a variety of different communities that were focused on, for the most part, neurodegenerative types of conditions. But in 2011, we opened to any condition. And today we have over 430,000 members reporting on data on about 2,500 different conditions. We have a deep knowledge in about 30 to 40 of those conditions because we strategically engage and intentionally think about how can we build this community in such a way that it will be robust enough where the data that we can gather from it actually becomes significant and important. But the important thing to keep in mind is that this is all patient-generated and patient-reported data on the site. So we've been at this for quite some time. I think the points here, just to emphasize, is that this is big data. We have 30 million structured data points, so data points that are actually collected within survey-type questions, but then also millions of pages of free text and qualitative data, much of which has yet to even be mined deeply to really understand all the insights that are there. To date, we have about 70 publications, most of those peer-reviewed, some with some of our colleagues in the room that we've done in terms of research collaborations. And really the point there being that these are, again, patient-generated data providing insights to answer important questions that are research-focused, but that are actually really emanating from patients themselves. Even some of our publications actually are co-authored by some patients that are on members of our site. So I think the notion here, and I'll reiterate Amy's point, this is such an incredibly vast, ubiquitous, and ever-growing source of data that we have to figure out the science behind it, the standards and the principles behind it in order to really begin to understand how to help advocates best not only ensure that it's collected well, that the people who are holding the data are good data stewards of it, but also that we have ways of being able to visualize and use it in effective ways for decision making. And those are really key points for us. You're at an advantage. I have to turn around and see what my slide's going to say. So to that point, we've made a lot of effort to ensure that we have structure to our data. So the information that you see behind me really is an illustration of our data layers and how that actually in many ways mirrors the kinds of data that you would find in an EHR because of the way we code it. However, that data is being generated by patients themselves, and so we then put that into perspective to a clinical concept so that we can actually have that data be clinically relevant or research relevant and understood at that kind of level. So all of our data is mapped to the various taxonomies that one would expect in an EHR. But I think, again, I really want to reinforce this emerging science behind patient-generated data, and we actually are, I think, are on the cusp of a real tipping point there, and I think everyone in this room who believes in the fact that patient-generated data is, in fact, the expert data, then I think we have an opportunity to really have big data for patients be really important. I just wanted to just give you a little bit of a preview into the kinds of things that we do from a big data perspective, imagining that we have all that data. Now, what do we do with it? We do publications, as I said before. We have many, many projects that are ongoing all the time. But the other thing is that we're creating a research portal. This is just a couple of images of that portal. You can see that there are some dashboards within this. And so if you are part of our community using the tools that we have, then you can get access to this. It's a subscription type of research portal. But we have community snapshots and survey volume types of information. But the one I'm going to tell you a little bit more about is our trial access. And so this is actually a set of questions where we're actually every member who now joins the site 25 days into their membership, they get a survey that asks them specific questions about their experience with clinical trials. Now, we had some baseline data that we did with thousands of patients that we already were members of the site, and now we're continually adding to that data set, so it's actually going to be an ongoing learning for us as well as patients. So these are the 8 areas that we delve into, and there's 46 different questions that patients are asked, and we are now starting to amass a significant amount of information about patients' experience with trials, whether they've even been asked to participate in a trial. 58% of our patients say no. They've never even been talked to about it. So there's no surprise that we have limited numbers of people participating in trials. So I just really wanted to give you a quick introduction to the vastness of what we see as being able to now take the data that we've been collecting over 11 years and continue to build on that. Some of the experiments that we've been doing as well has also been pulling in data from Fitbits and from other sensors, as well as EHR data. So we're now starting to able to match data with our data to external data sources. Had a recent publication come out recently where we took our data and tried to match the volunteers from that project against IMS claims data. We were able to match those data in 94% of the cases, 94% of the patients who volunteered. There were over 600 members who volunteered. We were able to identify them within the IMS claims data with at least 1 point. Now, many of them had multiple points, but what we were able to then do was give the data back to the patients and say, verify this. Were you on that drug? Are you on that drug? And so it was a really interesting experiment for us to test our ability to pull data in and out, but also for patients to have the ability to provide the veracity behind it. And I'll leave you with this. I think it's just incredibly important that we never lose sight of the fact that perspective really matters, and that for every point of data that any one of us may be amassing, the perception and the interpretation of it is going to vary. And I happen to love this one at the bottom where the person's perception of it is a duck. So keeping that in mind as big data is interpreted, behind every bit of that data is a person's story, just like Stephen Haywood's story led to something like Patients Like Me and our ability to start learning a whole lot more than we ever learned before about patient information. So I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thank you very much, Sally. On to Rachel.
Thank you. See. So I'm Rachel Florence. I work at Pecora, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute. So we, actually I have a bit of introduction on Pecora. We're an independent research institute, but we were funded out of the Affordable Care Act. And our board is a multi-stakeholder board, and it represents every element of the community. So we have patient stakeholders, researchers, government agencies, and industry members on our board. Our mandate is to fund comparative effectiveness research. And the way we've made our mark in the world is in funding research that only involves patients and stakeholders from at every step of the way. And so that's been sort of our hallmark from when we really started getting going in 2012. So Pecora's research seeks answers to questions that patients and caregivers and clinicians have in the day-to-day delivery of care. So that's sort of overall the Pecora organization that I work for. I am responsible for a program within Pecora called PecoraNet. So PecoraNet was a vision of our board back in 2012 of looking at our clinical research infrastructure across the country and really kind of listing all the problems that we have with this infrastructure, its slowness, its lack of engagement from many stakeholders, its fragmentation, the multiple incentives that slow down really the ability of many communities to get answers to the questions that they have when they enter into relationships with the healthcare system. And I'll say, I think, I'll just as an aside, I'll say, so my experience working professionally in the clinical research world is completely different from my experience as a patient or a caregiver. And I really don't know how to get access to big data or to the questions that I have when I go and see my doctor and I have to decide between treatment A or treatment B. And so I continue to be flummoxed at how I can be living in both worlds and yet I still don't see how they connect. So I'm looking forward to a time when all of us engaged in this kind of journey from different parts kind of are able to make these connections so that all of us can really feel we're empowered to make better decisions for ourselves and those that we love. So fast forwarding, our board decided they were going to put a large investment into improving clinical research infrastructure. And by that they meant both the clinical trial enterprise as well as the use of big data, so using observational studies. As sometimes funding agencies do, they took a big swing at it and they decided to fund both the health system side of this, so the actual delivery systems that generate data at the point of care between patients and doctors and many other contacts with the health system. So let me see, I think I have this. So I'm starting at the blue here. We have 13 large clinical data research networks that over the last 2 years have organized data in a common data model. We have currently 110 million patients data organized in that fashion, and we're about to launch our first queries, so the first questions that go out to the data partners that participate in the CDRNs, and looking to sort of see if we've been able to accelerate all the administrative processes for that, and our ability to get some answers to some questions. In terms of involvement of the community on that side, the CDRNs do have patient and stakeholder engagement in their governance, and we're also looking for our front door to be open to many different kinds of communities, including the patient advocate community. So foundations, patient groups could also knock on the door and say, here's our question, how can you help us answer this question? As part of our large experiment, we also funded 20 patient-powered research networks. And so the hypothesis there was if you provide a certain level of funding to groups of patients, foundations, researchers coming together to create a community of people that are going to be engaged in research, interested in asking questions and partnering with researchers, will that work, was basically the question. And of the 20 networks that came in, we had all different kinds of networks. We had grassroots-led organizations, we had academic registries, we had just more traditional academic medical centers partnering with patient groups and foundations. And so a real mixed bag and different experiments. And we're, I think, just at the point of sort of looking at, okay, what's worked and what's not worked in this experiment. And certainly on the spectrum, there's groups that are much more on the engagement front. So it's engagement above all, like creating the community is what's important to these groups. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the research groups, which are still very much kind of focused on rigorous traditional methods. And so it's the merger of these two that are going to be, I think, we're going to get the lessons of sort of what's been successful and what is not. I'll say in closing, it is a challenge for people to get interested and passionate about participating in research, because really, as patients and caregivers, our questions are not necessarily the ones that researchers have. They're not necessarily ones that can be easily answered by the data that's available. And so, again, back to sort of connecting these dots, I'd say overall, the PPRNs have been a great experiment, but it really is time to pull out the learnings and understand better what the barriers are for people to want to participate in this. And that's why I think this project, the BD4P project, and sort of the training aspect is really important, and this is important work that needs to be done.
Thank you, Rachel. Jane.
So I actually have some slides, but I'm not going to use them. But if you distribute the slides, you feel free. I could talk for at least a whole hour on this. But I'm the patient, so let me just give you a little, or the patient advocate, let me give you a slight background on, tell you a little bit about who I am, and then address some of the questions that Joel has and that are on the agenda. I'm a long-term cancer survivor. As Joel mentioned to our group, I'm actually a behavioral scientist by training. I used to teach statistics, and what he didn't mention, but it happens that I have a degree in computer science, but I got that degree before most of you were born, so it's not really necessarily relevant, but it does make me sort of interested, and I've, before health big data got popular, I would read popular books, not technical books, popular books about those things. I'm just that kind of person. There are a lot of different types of advocates and a lot of different room for them. But I call myself a research advocate, and I do most of my work in clinical trials and drug development, and increasingly policy related to that. And I think Amy previously talked about that being an interesting model. And what I want to do is give you a sense of some of the types of things that could be done in big data that are parallel to some of those, some of the ways that I got up to speed in this, and quite frankly, I sort of am comfortable and a self-learner, have a lot of confidence, have a big mouth, I'm a New Yorker. So that's what makes me sort of an advocate, or why I got here. I think one of the key things that we want to do, though, is get a much broader group of people who are comfortable and competent to be part of the community. And I would say that again and again, and it's one of the reasons I think we're trying to have the curriculum as face-to-face. Just learning how to ask questions, feeling comfortable doing that, feeling comfortable not knowing everything is something that I feel comfortable saying I don't know. A lot of patient advocates don't, and I think we have to sort of help them understand what they really do need to know, and that it's okay not to know everything. One of the things I often say as an advocate is, you know, we're all after the same thing. We're after improvement for patients. But I get the luxury of just looking at it from a patient point of view. And I can filter that, and there are other people, other stakeholders that have a different slant on it, but ultimately also want to help the patient. So we have to figure out what those other slants are, and we have to help the advocate realize that their slant primarily is from their patient experience, and that one of the things they need to do, and someone in the audience talked before about sort of communicating back with their communities. And I think an effective advocate has to both learn from the community what their issues are and then convey it back. So, you know, one of the things I would see some of our trainees may be doing is even like, you know, do a little mini training on big data to some of their constituents. The other thing that, you know, we had 3 wonderful examples here. One really is the patient data, but is run by, you know, the patient inputs it, the patients like me, but is run by more scientists. Another is really input, mostly input by clinicians, but Amy really wants to get more patient input. And Pecora is this new interesting model that is much more collaborative and has had patient partners throughout. And one of my sort of key philosophies about patient engagement, and I hope we can convey it here, is that that's what you really want to do. So rule number 1, get patients involved from the beginning. Rule number 2, I don't really like the ladies auxiliary model. You know, Amy talked about lots of different opportunities. Well, she's talking to a lot of stakeholders, and I want the patients after our training to be able to work with them. I don't want this little groups talking on the side to each other. That's my bias. The others sometimes work, and they're helpful, but you know, that's where I would sort of do. So I think I've sort of touched on some of Joel's questions. I'll certainly be comfortable opening my mouth as we get
Keep that, because